break of dawn to late night and get the truth straight from ADSN.
ADSN back on air. James Barrow here with Daniel Druger. Yes, our theme song is incredible. I did actually record it, and I play it while I run now. Occasionally, it's pretty great. My kids
visuals are the chef's kiss for me. But.
Yeah, but yeah, super pumped about today. We got a great little lineup. It's kind of fun how it came together. Originally, today was going to be just a conversation about a bunch of tweets that we were reading that Eric Seufert put out about the Meta trade deficit, and then also that Taylor Holiday put out about the impact of tariffs on e-com brands. But we're fortunate we reached out to them, and not only do they have a comment about it, but they're going to come on as co-hosts. So Seufert's going to be here. Taylor is going to be here. ADSN. This is where the conversation happens. We did it, bud.
We did it. We're making it. Super pumped to talk to Eric, talk to Taylor, really get into the supply side, the demand side, and see what's really happening and what we should expect affecting these businesses. So I think we should get into it. And maybe one final point, ADSN is made possible by DashFi, the only corporate card built for advertisers. So go check them out. But James, I think we get into it. Let's have Eric on.
Incredible readout too. Like you got a voice for radio. Is it face for radio? What do people say? Whatever. Let's get to Eric.
We got both. Let's get to Eric.
All right. Well, very lucky to have an awesome guest on today for ADSN, Eric Seufert. Eric, you kind of don't need an introduction, I think, in our world. So we'll kind of jump right in. I think what we'd love to just get your take on is what is going on right now in the ad markets in terms of these impact of tariffs and just sort of all the uncertainty. I'd love to just kind of maybe start can you give sort of a state of play of where we are and kind of what you think at least the kind of beginning innings of all this looks like?
Well, the beginning was yesterday, so this is the 10th. The tariffs went into effect yesterday. Although markets had kind of prepared for them, but I mean the stock market, adapting to what it thinks the economic drag is going to be is different from, the sort of advertising market adapting, because I think for one, I mean, a lot of advertisers are just not as plugged into the kind of macroeconomic dynamics as, the sort of perennially online crew of sort of Twitter degens is. And also it's just difficult to gauge what the impact's going to be. And you don't really need to bake it in because it'll be pretty apparent very quickly. Right. I mean, that's one of the nice things about direct response advertising is it's just very reactive, and teams can be very reactive to change. Right. So there's no need to prepare for it. And if anything, if I was a D2C brand or just a retailer that had a lot of exposure to Chinese production, I probably would have been ramping spend going into the tariffs just to try to get rid of, get rid of that inventory, or just to sort of not to get rid of the inventory, but just to take advantage of the lower ad prices, right? So and the lack of tariffs, right? So the thing about the impact on the ads market is it's going to be very pronounced in retail, and it probably won't have any effect whatsoever in the digital space, meaning digital goods. So apps and subscription apps and stuff. I know a lot of games companies are looking at this, and subscription apps companies are looking at this, and I don't think that the tariffs per se directly won't have any impact on their operating environment. And in fact, it might be good for them if ad prices drop. But if they cause a recession, then it'll impact everyone. But the thing about the impact of the tariffs, which has not been addressed whatsoever, right? I mean, Trump announced the 90-day moratorium or the delay, but not on China, and that's where the impact. That's the sort of source of this impact is Chinese production and Chinese advertisers, right? Are going to be what's disruptive to the ads market. It's not going to be EU advertisers or EU production, right? And so there's a couple things to think about, and there's going to be competing effects here, right? So one is, well, okay, as an advertiser who is selling stuff that's impacted by tariffs, you've kind of got one of two choices, right? You either absorb the tariff, which means you keep the price point constant for the consumer, right? But your margin degrades, right? And like, there's a lot of D2C that just can't eat margin. There's no way for them to do that. I mean, in a lot of retail, right? Or you just pass it along, right? Which is probably what's going to, or like some combination. You don't eat the whole thing. You don't pass along the whole thing. But there's some sort of middle point, right? So like, let's say you pass it along. Well, then we know what's going to happen to conversion rates. They're going to go down. So ROAS is going to go down. And so you have to reduce your bids, right? And if you eat the margin, if you somehow eat the margin, then the conversion rate stays the same, but your ROAS goes down because you're making less money per sale. So you have to decrease your bids, right? So in either of those cases, ROAS goes down. And so your bids go down and your spend goes down. Now, if you're like an American company that only sells to Americans, because again, keep in mind, like all these tariffs were being met with reciprocal tariffs. It's not just on inbound. It's going to be on outbound, right? The EU announced some reciprocal tariffs on certain categories of goods. Like China introduced like very substantial reciprocal tariffs, although, you can advertise to Chinese audiences. But any country that had a tariff placed on it, many of them, the most important markets probably for American advertisers were going to erect reciprocal tariffs themselves, right? So like, it's not just incoming, it's going to be outgoing. But if you're an American company and you only advertise to Americans and you do all your production in America, then this is probably a good thing, right? And I saw some arguments on Twitter. It's like, well, they'll just make up the gap. It's like, no, I don't think so. That's a very tiny proportion of advertisers you're talking about. It's very, I can't even really think of any. But maybe they exist. I don't know, John Deere or something like. But also because keep in mind, you're going to pay tariffs on components. Like even if you do assembly in the United States, you're not exempt from the tariffs if you have components that are built elsewhere, right? So the reality is, like, most advertisers probably have to reduce ROAS. Retail, right? E-com, D2C. Most advertisers probably have to reduce ROAS, which means reduce ROAS, which means they reduce their bids, which means they spend less, right? And so, well, then that's what the effect is going to be. It's going to be sort of a compression of ROAS, compression of bids, and like just reduced overall spend.
And you've talked a lot about it previously, like the black box of these platforms, just getting smarter in kind of how they're determining the right user to show the ad to and driving that performance. But with such a dramatic and swift change in both consumer behavior and advertiser behavior, like, would you expect to see like these black box algorithms like kind of break for a period of time? Like Meta's algorithm just not knowing who to serve the ad to as effectively as they did when it was maybe a more constant or stable market?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hadn't thought about it, but these kinds of algorithms don't do well with like shocks. And yeah, there's a possibility that they just go haywire. But I think one other thing, because you mentioned consumer behaviors, right? So like, let's say that I'm a company that has like very, sort of enviable margins, and I'm able to just eat this for a while because I don't think it's going to be this long-term drag. Well, consumer behavior is still going to change, even if my price point doesn't, because like all the other things they're buying are more expensive, right? And so it kind of depends on where you're at in like the necessity curve. If you're, like if there's anything that can be a cheaper substitute for you, it doesn't really matter if your price point changes. Right? Like people will probably move to the substitute. And I mean, if you're a necessity and people are totally price insensitive, that's different. But like if you're not, which most products are not, it doesn't really matter if your price point changes or not, because consumers are going to be squeezed. Like they're going to be paying more for everything, including a lot of the staples, a lot of the things that don't have any substitute goods.
Yeah. And, it's interesting, just like, obviously thinking about it from like the e-com perspective, like I have a ton of empathy for those businesses just because like this seems kind of impossible to navigate, to be totally honest. But also from the ad platform perspective, which I know, like, just given our backgrounds, we have empathy for them. And like, I don't think people quite understand how impactful foreign spend is for these ad platforms. Like if you look at like Snapchat, for example, I mean, the amount of advertising that has been from Chinese advertisers is gigantic. Like Temu, obviously in the early days, there was all this TikTok stuff.
Yeah.
But you put out this article today, or I think yesterday, about like what happens in these markets on Mobile Dev Memo. And you talked about basically the meta revenue by user geography and customer geography. Can you kind of just like talk through that? Because I don't think people quite understand there is there is effectively like a trade deficit when it
Yeah.
comes to advertising that no one really thinks about.
Well, it kind of came to the fore when Temu was ramping spend, right? Because people were worried that Temu represented a risk for Facebook specifically, right? Because, okay, so let's just take a step back, go back to TikTok, right? So like TikTok, I would say famously, I think it's famous within like performance marketing circles, but it's not well known. They grew by spending a lot of money on user acquisition, right? I mean, I wrote this piece, TikTok's $1 billion secret that wasn't. They spent like $1 billion on user acquisition, I think, just in the United States in 2018. They were largest single advertiser on Facebook, largest single advertiser on Snapchat. I mean, they were spending their way into into the scale that they enjoy now. But the thing about Temu, and I mean, so there was kind of there's a belief that maybe like, well, if Temu is doing the same thing, they're spending an inordinate amount of money, and it's owned by a public company, so we could see how much the marketing cost was, and it was like $3 billion, I think, for 2022 or maybe $3 billion in 2023. So it's substantial, right? I mean, like almost unprecedented. And the question was like, okay, well, is this a risk then? Is this like an acute risk for Facebook? Because like, what happens if they pull back and spend, right? And like what I was arguing, and then what people were doing was they highlighted that differential, right? So like when Facebook reports advertising revenue by geography, they report it by the user's geography, right? So the person that was targeted. But in their 10K and 10Q, they break out revenue by customer geography, which means the person who's spending the money, right? So they don't break it out by type. So that also includes like hardware sales and other. But advertising is 97% of Meta's revenue, and it's probably even more in like APAC. But you see, there is a differential, right? So the thing is, Chinese advertisers, or so APAC advertisers, were spending more than money was being spent on APAC users, right? Which makes sense because you can't reach Chinese audiences. They don't. Yeah. Facebook is blocked, right? And Instagram is blocked, right? So that makes sense kind of on its face. But I mean, I think a big part of that is it's probably not, Vietnamese companies or whatever. It's the large Chinese companies buying users in the US principally, but also like in Europe, right? And what I argued at the time was that I didn't think Temu was representing an acute risk for Facebook, assuming some pullback in spend, because the point I was making was like, Facebook's ads, sort of client portfolio is very like long tailed, and the reality is like the bulk of their revenue comes from the long tail, not like the biggest advertisers. And the sort of proof point of that was the advertiser, what do you call it? The the strike or whatever, the boycott. So like there was no impact whatsoever. I mean, like these big brand advertisers pulled back spend or stopped spend, and there's Facebook grew more that quarter than they had. Now that was the start of COVID, so that, it's a little bit hard to parse. But the point is, and I wrote this piece about it, like the big economy of small advertisers. These platforms, like in success, they're serving SMBs. And the big advertisers, on an individual basis, they could be spending a lot of money, but like as a group of the big advertisers, it pales in comparison to like a long tail of SMBs, right? And the way I sort of like tried to prove that was I sort of looked at the historical APAC revenue by customer, and I demeaned it starting from when Temu started scaling, right? So like you saw, basically there was no change, because it's just basically tracking to the mean. And then when Temu started, it was like big change, right? But even that big change wasn't that much relative to Facebook's revenue, right? It was some, low single digit percentage. So that's what I said was a risk if they just shut it off to zero, right? Which they wouldn't do. But that's actually problematic when it comes to tariffs, right? Because if it's one company, two companies, three companies that say, hey, we got to scale back because we're subject to these tariffs, then that you can weather that. But if it's systematic and it's the vast majority of the advertisers in that region, which are mostly spending their money outside of that region, then that is a risk, right? That is a systematic risk. And so the thing is like Susan Lee came out, the CFO of Meta, came out like a couple quarters after there was this sort of like, this open question that was, that was reverberating around Twitter. It was like, is this a risk? And she said, look, I want to say it was some very, very substantial majority of our Chinese advertising revenue comes from outside of the top 10 largest advertisers, right? I think it was like 60% comes from outside the top 10 or something like that. It was a large majority. Well, okay, then that means there is really a risk if this broad-based tariff is placed on Chinese exporters, right? Who are, some of them are just advertising and selling, but some of them are providing, the inputs or whatever. Like, that's going to be really problematic when you look at that sort of tranche of revenue. And so I had a bid in that piece, because I mean, this is kind of an idea that I've been thinking about for a long time, right? So I've been tracking the numbers. I had a bid in that piece. I just showed there's that trade deficit. They're the only reporting region that has that trade deficit, where they spend more on foreign, like outside of region audiences than their audiences receive in ad spend.
Yeah, well, and then if you play that out, and you had this piece, I was just looking it up, but the small platform syndrome one that you put out a few months ago. I don't know. I was trying to look up when you did it. That was a few months ago. You put out so much stuff. But if you play that out, like, so if it's a risk for Meta, obviously we always just talk about Snap, but like, man, this is a risk probably for the small platforms that are kind of caught in the middle, right? Like, to squeeze on the e-com side and then to squeeze on this side. I mean, it's like, I guess if you look at the playing field, it kind of makes me think maybe, like, ironically, AppLovin gets to weather this well. Like, if you have like a portfolio that's going to perform well for app install, I guess AppLovin should do well. Maybe Apple Ads. Maybe this is like a big moment for them to like really push. I know we've talked about them before, but who do you think set up to actually take advantage of this, at least on the ad side? Forget about the other tertiary businesses that an Apple would have.
Well, so the bigger problem, like with the small platform syndrome bucket of companies, is that they're more exposed to brand generally, right? So like the bigger companies, like I said, in Success, you're servicing SMBs as an ad platform, right? So like that's direct response advertisers, that's performance advertisers, right? A lot of these smaller platforms, like brand, like the smaller the platform is generally, kind of as a rule of thumb, like the larger the proportion of brand spend. Well, guess what happens in a recession? Brand spend shifts into performance. You shift the optimization from top of funnel to bottom of the funnel, right? And so what are you going to do then? You can probably shift. There's going to be share shift away from those platforms, right? So that's not a geo thing. That's a strategy thing. That's like, hey, in a recessionary environment, I'm not really investing in brand as much. I'm investing in direct sales, right? And so a lot of that money might shift over to the bigger platforms. That's kind of what I said in the piece. Like, there are these conflicting effects, right? Like, okay, well, Meta's exposed on the e-com side, certainly, because of the tariffs on China, right? Which have not been paused, right? Those are ongoing, right? And they just got ratcheted up. But it's also there's that secondary risk or like, I don't know, parallel risk of the Chinese advertiser spend, but they probably also benefit from a lot of brand spend flowing to them, right? So I don't know which of those is a sort of bigger effect. In terms of companies that like probably weather this well, I think Amazon's well positioned with its advertising business, but its core retail business could get threatened here because of the Chinese tariffs, right? But from an advertising business, like, you want to go closer to the metal. Like, as an advertiser, you want to go as close as possible to the transaction. You can't get any closer than Amazon, right? Yeah. I think in terms of like just the ad networks that service the mobile app economy, they're probably fine. But again, if you go into a recession, the thing about the mobile app economy is, like, I wrote this piece a while back, like during COVID, actually, just kind of gaming out like what happens in a recession to mobile free-to-play games. And my point was, like, probably engagement goes up because that is a substitute good. A mobile free-to-play game is a substitute good for console games, PC console games that cost 60, 80, $100, right? But IAPs are not. I said, look, they sort of exhibit the same characteristics as luxury goods because totally discretionary, right? Not needed to play the game. And so I think you could see the unit economics compress in gaming, even if engagement goes up. And if that's the case, then bids are going to go down. So you might get more installs, but they're going to be cheaper installs because people are just able to spend less because the users are monetizing to a lesser degree.
Yeah, and as you're talking through that, I was trying to map out in my head, like, if that all happens, you kind of use Amazon. Obviously, like the retail business could struggle, ads business would be strong, but then if you look at someone like Apple right now, who like probably has a ton of risk, right, on the hardware side, at least on the margins. Yeah, this is probably the moment if you were going to try to just ratchet up ad revenue and turn into an ads business and ratchet up services. This is probably the moment to like strike. I don't know, like, I mean, I know that I don't know if they can get away with it from a regulatory environment perspective, but like, is it fair to think that like if they're ever going to go for real, this is it?
I mean, that's a great point, right? I mean, they're going to have to accelerate the services revenue growth if these tariffs have the kind of like price effect that, for instance, like the Wall Street Journal estimated last weekend, right? I mean, there's hardware sales, or I mean, there's an argument that like iPhone buyers are price insensitive. I think that's probably true to a point, but not at because we see these sort of gradual price increases, but not this dramatic, right? I mean, I think at least in the short term, people can say, I'm not upgrading this cycle. It's going to cost that much. And so I think there's some price insensitivity, but it's not total price insensitivity, right? I mean, there's going to be friction here. And so I think there's just going to be a real focus on the services revenue business, and that's ads, that's App Store, and App Store revenues. That's all, Apple TV Plus, it's iTunes. And so like, I think they're just going to have to focus on that. And like, what's probably the thing that where they could have like the most impact quickly is probably ads. I think they're sitting on some things that they could launch now. Right. And, you just saw that they integrated SK Ad Network into Apple Search Ads. They also integrated View Through into Apple Search Ads. Right. So there is movement there. We'll see what that ends up like sort of resulting in. But my sense is like, okay, well, if you see like probably the only realistic growth driver that's in your control is that segment of the services business. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they did something, dramatic.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is an interesting point. But it's also, I think the other half of that coin is the advertiser, right? As you said, if they're retail good getting compressed by 15%, 20% margin on the free-to-play side, if IAP isn't kind of as efficient as it used to be, we're probably seeing consolidation in platforms. Like you said, like you're getting to direct response, you're killing brand budget, you're consolidating budgets and going to where it works. So I'm curious, like looking back at 2020, even earlier than that, like have you seen this play out? And like, what is I know the reaction when the volatility hits is swift, but what about the recovery? Like, how long does it take to recover from something like this once there's some stability in the market, once tariffs are kind of understood as like either this is firm or, we're going to start to lighten up?
Yeah, so again, like it's there's a couple questions here, right? So like the kind of my favorite, sort of economist personality is this guy named Mark Zandi. He's head of economics at Moody Analytics, and he posted today that he maintains his 60% recession risk before the end of the year. Right, Goldman kind of rolled theirs back, so they had increased their likelihood to 60. I want to say 260 from 45, and they rolled that back to 45. So a little bit of a whipsaw, but Mark Zandi says 60%, right? Like the bigger question is not the impact of the tariffs that just creates like a new equilibrium, and that'd be bad for like a lot of segments, but like the very specific segments. If there's a recession, then everything just sort of gets, the new equilibrium kind of goes through this dynamic sort of vicious cycle, right? And so that's the problem with recessions. And so we just don't know what that is. Like, I think if it's just the tariffs, well, it's kind of like a one-off. I mean, there's some knock-on effects, but like if it's a recession, like we just don't know how long or deep that would be. And the thing is, like, we didn't really see a recession with COVID. It was like a very short recession. But the thing is, the recovery was dramatic, right? Yeah. So it was like this V-shaped, phenomenon because everyone then was at home and, they were spending a lot of money, especially in like, digital goods and stuff. And so I think it's really hard to know how a lot of these categories react to a true recession because we've never really seen one. I mean, you go back to 2008, like the ads market didn't look like it does now. I mean, there weren't even mobile games, like free-to-play mobile games back then, right? Just for as one example, but D2C didn't really exist. Certainly, like just the AEO didn't exist, like VO did, like, you know what I mean? Like all these like app install ads didn't exist. The digital ads market looks a lot different now than it did in 2008.
Yeah, well, I partly blame you for this, but there also wasn't everything was the ad network phenomena
right
at the time either. And so you look at all these ads businesses in a recession, there's no way all of these things can basically sort of, they kind of just don't, all of them don't deserve to exist in a
Right.
recession. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon. I don't think people are really kind of thinking through the, it makes you really think Apple should get rid of its, all of the take rate they have on for third party for installs, everything, and just go all in on ads.
Right.
Like that would be, they should just, that'd be their moment to be a hero.
Well, the thing about the take rate is like it's a little bit deceiving because it's like the vast majority of app developers pay 15%. I mean, that's because there's a small business rate, right? It's 15%, right? And then all year 2 subs pay 15%, right? It's just
but even to bring that to zero now and then run the ads business, that would be interesting. I don't know. I wonder if they
probably on net it would make more money. I think. I mean, I haven't thought about it for more than just the 10 seconds here, but I wouldn't be surprised if that made more money on net. But to your point, it's like all the sort of like emergent retail media. I think a lot of the CTV that's still seen as experimental. And what happens in a recession? You shift your money out of experimental. It's a flight to quality. So I think a lot of the everything is an ad network is kind of at risk here because it's still experimental budget.
Yeah. Well, man, thank you for walking us through it. I'm excited to see what you come out with next. Everyone should read this latest thing you have on Mobile Dev Memo. We'll have images to it in here, but it's crazy. So thanks, man, for doing this, and appreciate you coming on ADSN.
Appreciate you having me. Always good to talk to you guys.
All right, man. Take care.
From the break of dawn to late night and get the truth straight from ADSN.
All right, so we just wrapped up with Eric Seufert talking about the impact of tariffs on the ad platforms. Now we're bringing on Taylor Holiday to talk about tariffs from the other side, from the brands, the direct-to-consumer e-commerce merchants. Taylor, welcome.
Yeah, excited
ADSN.
to be here, guys. I told Eric, hopefully, if you're listening, I said that's a tough act to follow, man. So I wish I could hear what you said, so I could make sure and just say I agree. But I'm on the clock following a smart dude.
Unfortunately, he was really smart. No, he crushed it as always. Well, thank you, man, for doing this. I mean, you've been, I've seen a bunch of your tweets all week, but it'd be great, based on what you're seeing right now, just with all the brands that you work with, what reality are we actually living in right now based on what you're seeing?
Yeah, it's a good way to phrase it because it does feel multidimensional in the sense that we live in these different worlds that are changing and evolving all the time. But I guess standing here today, it's April 10th at 2:45 PST. And we now have a narrowed set of focused tariffs that are mainly aimed at China, it would seem, with a 10% blanket tariff that's around the world. And then the other big piece that I think is really critical for our industry is that the de minimis exchange is still going away on May 2nd. And so that combination of things is basically impossible to stomach for most e-commerce brands, is that if the present landscape continues, it means that there's just a giant swath of businesses that are non-viable as they're presently constructed, and they have to completely redefine their supply chain if this is going to continue. Now, if it's gone tomorrow, then fine. But sitting here today, it's really hard to imagine the underlying economics of an e-commerce business working with an 130% tariff on Chinese goods.
And you put out a tweet, I think earlier today, where you kind of laid out, over the last 28 days, what you're seeing from the data you have access to. And I think, a few of the ones that just stood out, right? Spend is still increasing, and valid, this is over 28 days. So, spend is increasing, but CAC has dramatically increased and marketing efficiency has dramatically decreased. And so like, what do you attribute a lot of that to? Are we going to continue to see that trend, you think, at least as far as uncertainty?
So I think we have to be careful to conflate the consumer environment for the tariff environment a little bit, because I'm not sure how hyper aware every everyday consumer is of sort of exactly what's happening here and how much that is at this moment in time exactly showing up as an effect. I think what we're seeing over the last 30 days is a trend that started back in January, which is a general declining consumer sentiment overall. Now, these things are all sort of connected to the macro economy in some sense, but I think that prior to this tariff stuff even showing up, brands were having trouble with new customer acquisition efficiency before their underlying COGS got flipped on its head.
Do you think, just hearing it, like, I don't know, like, do you think anyone in the administration cares or knows what this is going to do to, like, but these are a bunch of like American entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah.
Like, employ a lot of people. I think, like, it's like kind of like the definition of like a modern entrepreneur, kind of, I feel like in a lot of ways, is like these businesses. Do you think that they know what's going on at all?
It's hard to sort through rhetoric to get to what people genuinely believe or care about. But if we assert goodwill for a second and take people at their word, what I'm hearing is about a bigger story beyond the short-term suffering, is that there's a bigger play of what America and the future of American business and American production is, and what our relationships are like on the global landscape, that feels like some of this had to be baked into that idea, that they had to know that there were going to be short-term implications to this, that we're going to be part of this, that there was going to be some group of people that were going to experience hardship as the result of these tariffs. Like, these people are too smart in these seats to not have a consideration for that effect, but they genuinely, it seems, believe that there's a long-term benefit for America in this strategy. And so I don't know that the e-commerce business operator is at the top of the list of the groups that they're concerned about. But yet the effects of these policies may be most dramatically felt in our industry versus any other, to be honest. Like, it may be most acutely felt there in reality.
And are you seeing, like, I guess, and it's probably hard to tell, but just maybe anecdotally, like, what percentage of e-com businesses have China supply chain reliance versus like Vietnam?
85%. I mean, it's a massive number. There's just, don't quote me on that. Ask ChatGPT. It could give you probably a better answer. But the point I'm making with my answer, more than the specific, is that generally everyone does is the answer. Now, of course, there are some products that come out of all over the world for sure. But the reality is the vast majority of this industry comes imported from China. And part of that is that, like, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say that the entire underlying framework of the D2C business model is the idea that you have a direct relationship with a manufacturer and that you are circumnavigating the middleman retailer to an end consumer. That's how it all started. That was the premise, which all of that manufacturing, like, it doesn't exist here. All of it exists as an import from Chinese manufacturing, or at least Southeast Asia broadly. And so the reality is the vast majority of it. And this is where I think we have to, as an industry, sort of accept that we've played a game to benefit from a global, free trade driven, competitive global supply chain to our benefit. Like, we have attempted to leverage that as much as anyone, because the price that we could produce our goods and the quality, not just the price, but the quality at the price, was best in that region. And on top of that, I think the other thing that, and I've heard Mike Beckham from Simple Modern talk about this, is that a lot of the e-commerce industry was taking advantage of the 321 exchange and de minimis exchange through Mexico or through Canada, where you were importing stuff from China and then fulfilling direct to consumer through Mexico. All the things that everybody was critical of Temu and Shein. The truth is that a lot of our industry was doing it too. I heard Ryan from Flexport say that 30% of the top 100 retailers on Shopify were taking advantage of 321. Like, they were skirting the rules, and now all of a sudden everyone's subject to the tariff, but we built a business on that loophole.
That's crazy. Do you think that a lot of these businesses knew they were doing it, or they thought they were just basically importing from Mexico?
No, they knew. They set up the supply chain to import and avoid, and then direct fill from the consumer, because there was an existing tariff on China already that existed that was being completely circumnavigated through that process. And so,
dude, that's crazy.
And again, I don't want to assert that that's nefarious in any way. Like, that was well within the rules. They were it was business strategy to minimize your costs. but at the same time to understand that there's a very populist, nationalist agenda coming forward. You could see how that could potentially be on the radar of a group of people who have very clearly been pro-American manufacturing and America not getting screwed by its global trade partners. That feels like a way in which you're trying to avoid the tariff policy that they were intending to benefit and prevent exactly that.
And I mean, that took, a handful of years, I'm sure, to like optimize and get the right, supply chain processes to extract the value relative to competitors. How fast do these companies react now? If there's this 125% or whatever it is today tariff on China, what does it take to then identify a manufacturer in Vietnam, start to replicate that process?
Necessity is the mother of innovation, and that's the one thing I will say is that it will be solved at the rate at which it's absolutely possible for it to be solved, because the monetary incentive will be great for these brands. Like the reality is that like the e-commerce business model is non-viable with an 125% tariff on the import of your goods. Like that's not like we'll just cut back Facebook spend. Like no, that makes the business model non-viable. So you have to reconstruct the supply chain, and you have like very minimal amounts of time to do it, depending on how much inventory you have on hand. So I think all of this is in the short term, you have this existing inventory in your warehouse that's already bought, paid for, and you want to maximize the marginal value of the SKUs on hand. So you're going to see probably brands like stop the discounting, really trying to maximize the marginal value of all the stuff they have on hand to slow down the pace and duration of that inventory while they reconstruct the supply chain coming back. But they have to, and they're going to move quickly. And in many ways, I've heard of a lot of the Chinese manufacturing scene had started to set up sort of alternative vehicles through Vietnam, through the Philippines, through other parts of Southeast Asia, that is functionally the same supplier, just different. So same tooling, all your molds, et cetera, in place to be able to do that. I think there's a lot of incentive for the manufacturers to do this. Their business is on the line too. And so I think we're going to see people move as quickly as is humanly possible.
Do you think, like, I mean, it's probably kind of an obvious question, but like, we're going to see this, and Seufert just talked about it, but like, we're going to see this show up in the ad platforms. Like, it's going to have to soften these marketplaces, right?
The question is like, what brand and how many of these brands can reduce the flow of money that these ad platforms are creating for them and survive? Like, even if you just think about like the float on, I spend money on a credit card that I pay 30 days from the moment I spend it, but I realize that cash today, like we're talking about liquidity challenges that daily revenue flow covers a lot of obligations. And I don't know that a ton of brands are in a position to really step off that.
Interesting.
Now, bigger ones, larger brands can sustain off their existing customer base and some amount of organic demand that exists for a while. But a lot of brands, like the money that they make every single day, the contribution margin, I'm not just talking about the ad spend, the contribution dollars that they generate are a direct byproduct of the ad spend that they're deploying. If they were to take their foot off that gas, those dollars go away. And so I don't know that we're past the era of a lot of brands spending out to negative unit economics and negative lifetime value to CAC and using venture dollars to fund hyper inefficient ad spend. Like that doesn't really exist nearly as much as it did in 2020. And so the money that's being spent today is at least closer to incremental positive contribution than it's ever been. And so I don't know that there's a lot of like pullback equals better result for a lot of people.
And I mean, and a similar thought. I mean, I think you've talked about it a lot too, but like all of the suppliers to these brands, so the software, the tech stacks, like all of the service providers, like I think you're a huge proponent of like reevaluating your stack, cutting back, lean OpEx. And so, I mean, we're going to see ripple effects in ads markets, maybe tier 2, tier 3 ads markets in particular. But I imagine also across software, where these businesses are looking at where they.
That's where I think this goes first. Like, is I think it shows up in labor. I think it shows up in software. I think it shows up in you're going to the reality is the suppliers are going to have to eat it a lot too. Is that you're going to have to go back to your supplier and say, I need that 5 points of margin back. I need that 10 points of margin. I need you to float me this cash on different terms, or I go away as a business partner. And the reality is the cost of capital is cheaper in China, so they can afford some of that better than we can here in the United States. And so I think you're going to see it diffused, but the last place people want to take it is they don't want to slow growth. Like slow growth is a cascading set of problems that create negative consequences. So I think as much as possible, and I'll tell you, even across our client base, we're not getting a bunch of calls to cut ad spend. So I think that is like in many cases the last place people want to have to cut for e-commerce
Or can.
it can't, right?
Yeah.
Like it just
Yeah.
that is the lifeblood that is supplying the daily money machine, right?
Yeah.
So I think the tertiary ad platforms, the exploratory advertising, the top of funnel stuff, the television, the podcast, the out of home, the trying AppLovin or Snapchat or TikTok or whatever it might be, it'll concentrate into a little bit clearer and obvious return. But this tends to be where Meta shines, candidly. It tends to capture a greater share of wallet that even if the pie shrinks a little, you're still going to see that benefit. Now, if you combine this with like horrific consumer sentiment and a recession that actually shows up in everyday person's wallet, then yeah, that's going to affect the total, the performance of that media generally. But that's sort of independent, the COGS issue.
And do you see like, I mean, I guess to some extent, maybe it's Meta, like, but who wins? Like, whose hand is better because of this? Like, you could argue maybe without the recession, Meta's is, but like, is there anyone else that's not obvious to you? Like Amazon versus Shopify? Like, I don't know, like anyone you're just like, you know what, this actually strengthened them a little bit.
Well, I think there's a question of like, who's got the best balance sheet when you start the war, right? Like in the sense that, let's imagine we're on a competitive SERP, like search engine results page for men's denim. And every one of those brands has some underlying unit economics, some redundancy in their supply chain. Maybe it's zero, maybe it's some underlying cash position, access to capital that can help them to make a decision about how aggressive they can be about taking market from the category. And there are going to be some brands who come into this moment better positioned to take the short-term hit and drive volume to capture market share and suffocate people, right? Like if I was in a great position right now, I'd be trying to drive up the price of every click on Google to the point that I know all my competitors are just not even remotely can't sustain it at all. And so I think there are going to be some brands that like to the victor go the spoils of this sort of moment where I think there's going to be, unfortunately, it's the smaller brands I think that get hurt the most in this moment because they need every click to be profitable or they can't make payroll in 3 weeks. Like you can't play that game. Whereas if I'm a large scale brand and I have a good balance sheet, like I might put a little pressure on right now and take some of those competitive environments and really drive market capture.
And maybe taking that one step further, I mean, to me, that sounds like the companies that were maybe started 5, 6, 7 years ago that have weathered now iOS changes, COVID, recession, post-COVID, like all of these headwinds along the way. And I think, the name of the game over the last 2.5 years has been profitability, right? How do you not have to raise another dollar? How do you be a self-sustaining business? It sounds like those are the ones that are going to most likely survive this. Like they've unintentionally built the business that can weather this storm at least.
It depends on where they are in that
that
second part of the journey, which is how much have they gone through the capitulation to their old business model and have now become profitable and self-sustaining and healthy. Like I've seen a lot of because what happened was the bigger you got during COVID, the longer you were able to resist having to fix it because you had this like war chest of revenue and money and success. And so it took you a really long time to actually get in trouble. Whereas if you weren't that big, you got in trouble really fast and you had to fix it faster. And
That's
so
interesting. Yeah.
There's this tension in that. So I actually think like it's actually the legacy players even before that, I think, that are sort of better positioned. If you have omni-channel distribution, if you have a really successful, your own stores or whatever it might be, where you can pressure the D2C channel a little bit. If you happen to have supply chain in other places and you aren't subject to the same constraints, like you're going to press. You're not just going to like sit and stay stagnant. If you know your competitor is sourcing from China and can't afford to bid on that SERP, like, I'm going to go take all of that. Give me all of it. And I think that it's hard to know the exact health of every business, but I think that there are also going to be some deals done. Like, I would go look at like the deal that like True Classic just did. They're an example of a business that grew up during COVID era, is in apparel, has been sourcing product from all over the place, has been running through Mexico and other elements, and just raised a huge round. The sort of terms of which I think are as much about sustaining and surviving through this moment and getting into broader distribution. They just announced Costco and Target and all these other things, as it is about like just this like successful growth round against the D2C business model. I think there's sort of some people that are going to be pursuing those kinds of opportunities to say, hey, we're going to move into a full-fledged brand at this moment to try and offset some of the D2C exclusive risk that exists in this moment.
Wow. Then before we let you go, you mentioned one thing. Do you think, do a lot of these brands, this is just sort of me, just probably me being naive, but do a lot of these brands know where their competitors source supply from? Is it like, can you figure it out pretty easily?
Yeah, there's been all sorts of like things that have come up where you can reverse engineer your supplier, the supplier for different brands. And a lot of people do that kind of competitive analysis. And candidly, a lot of them are being made in the same factories in many cases, right? So like there's a, and then a lot of them, like there are brands, like I'll get, without naming the brand, we work with a brand in the golf space that makes an item of golf equipment that is the primary manufacturer for every major brand in the space and has their own brand public facing. And they're controlled by the same manufacturer, right? And that's not abnormal. There's a lot of that where manufacturers realize, like, wait a second, like all you are is like a Shopify website, and that's what makes you, a brand. I can build a Shopify website, right? And so I think you had a lot of that too, where there are actually manufacturers with brands in the same place that they're providing sourcing to a lot of other competitors for the same product categories. Like that's not abnormal in e-commerce.
Crazy, man. Well, thank you for shedding light on all this stuff. It's like, it's wow. We got to have you back on ADSN when we see when this all unfolds and see what next batch of random tariffs come out. But yeah, man,
exactly.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's cool, guys. I think the next 2 weeks, there's a lot of wait and see. The reality is that this is like a crazy, it's like the 5th once in a lifetime event. That's kind of what I put out today, is like, I'm tired of talking about like how it's a black swan event. It's like our 9th in the last couple of years. So it's been quite a roller coaster for the brands, and I empathize with people that are going through it. Hang tough. And as always, I think people will figure out a way, because that's what we do. So thanks for having me, guys.
All right. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
From the break of dawn to late night and get the truth.